It was an unassuming afternoon on the corner of Maple and Fifth, where the world seemed to move at its usual, steady pace. The street bustled with the sounds of everyday life, the occasional honk of a car, the laughter of children playing nearby, and the rhythmic tap of footsteps on the pavement. Amidst this scene, the aroma of sizzling kebabs wafted through the air, drawing attention to a modest food cart nestled under the sprawling shade of an old oak tree. The cart was nothing extraordinary, just a small setup with a metal grill, a neat display of ingredients, and a handwritten sign that read, "Roy's Kebabs, fresh and delicious." Behind the cart stood a quiet, middle-aged man. His name was Roy Patel, but everyone in the neighborhood simply called him Mr. Roy. He wore a simple baseball cap, an apron slightly worn at the edges, and a smile that seemed permanently etched on his face. He greeted each customer with a warm nod and a soft, "What can I get for you today?" To the locals, Mr. Roy was a familiar figure, a reliable presence in their daily lives. He never missed a day at his cart, rain or shine. The kids loved him for his cheerful demeanor and the occasional free skewer he handed out. The office workers stopped by during their lunch breaks, swearing his kebabs were the best in town. But despite his friendly interactions, Roy was a man of few words. He worked with quiet efficiency, his movements precise and deliberate. Each skewer he prepared looked identical, each kebab grilled to perfection. Customers often marveled at his attention to detail, though no one really thought to ask about his life beyond the cart. To most people, Roy was just another vendor, a man making an honest living. But those who looked closer might have noticed something unusual. His hands, for example, were not the hands of a typical street vendor. They were strong and steady, the fingers slightly calloused, with faint scars running across his knuckles. His posture was always upright, his eyes calm but alert, as if he were constantly observing his surroundings. Today, however, there was an energy in the air that felt different. It wasn't something obvious, just a subtle shift that only the most perceptive might notice. Perhaps it was the way Roy's gaze lingered a fraction longer on the faces of passers-by. Or the faint crease in his brow that appeared when he turned to adjust the grill. Whatever it was, no one could have guessed the truth about Roy Patel. Because beneath the apron and baseball cap, this humble street vendor carried a secret, a life story filled with experiences and skills that most people couldn't begin to imagine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement as Roy went about his work. A young couple approached the cart, their hands intertwined. "2 chicken kebabs, please," the man said, smiling. "Coming right up," Roy replied, his voice calm and steady. He turned to the grill, the skewers already sizzling with a soft hiss. As he worked, Roy's mind wandered not far, but just enough to take him back to another time. A time when his days weren't spent serving food but leading men. A time when his hands weren't flipping skewers but navigating treacherous terrains, handling weapons, and strategizing under pressure. It felt like a lifetime ago. And in some ways, it was. "Here you go," he said, handing the kebabs to the couple with a polite nod. They thanked him and walked away, their laughter fading into the distance. Roy took a moment to glance at the sky. The afternoon was unusually warm, the kind of day that brought more people out to the streets. Business was steady, as it always was. But Roy couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be different. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing and joking as they walked. One of them glanced at the cart and shouted, "Smells good, Uncle Roy." "Maybe later." Roy chuckled softly. "I'll save a skewer for you," he replied, his tone light. Despite the easy interactions, there was a tension building inside him. It wasn't fear or anxiety, those were emotions Roy had learned to control long ago. It was more like a heightened sense of awareness, a gut feeling that something was about to happen. As the afternoon wore on, the flow of customers continued. A woman in a business suit stopped by for a quick lunch, followed by a delivery driver who barely paused long enough to take his order. Each interaction was brief but pleasant, and Roy carried on with his usual rhythm. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind was working. Years of training had taught him to pay attention to details, to notice things others might overlook. And today, he couldn't help but notice the unusual energy in the air. It wasn't just his imagination. There was a tension in the way people moved, a sense of unease that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Roy's eyes darted briefly to the street corner, where a group of young men on motorcycles had just pulled up. They were loud, their voices carrying over the noise of the city. Dressed in leather jackets and worn boots, they exuded an air of arrogance, the kind of confidence that came from knowing people were too intimidated to challenge them. Roy watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to his grill, flipping the skewers with practiced ease. But even as he focused on his work, his mind remained alert. Years in the army had taught him to read situations quickly, to assess threats and plan responses in seconds. And though he had left that life behind, those instincts had never faded. A young boy approached the cart, holding a few crumpled bills in his small hand. "One kebab, please," he said, his voice barely audible. Roy crouched slightly to meet the boy's eye level, his smile softening. "Chicken or lamb?" he asked gently. "Chicken," the boy replied. Roy prepared the skewer, handing it to the boy along with a napkin. "Here you go," he said. "Enjoy." The boy nodded shyly before running off, his mother waiting nearby with a grateful smile. Moments like these reminded Roy why he loved this work. It wasn't just about making a living, it was about connecting with people, being part of a community. But as he straightened and turned back to his grill, his gaze flickered once again to the group of bikers. They were still there, laughing and gesturing loudly, their presence impossible to ignore. Roy's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling they would be trouble. And for the first time in years, he found himself mentally preparing not for a battle, but for whatever challenge the day might bring. What none of the passers-by knew was that this quiet, middle-aged man had faced far greater challenges in his lifetime. They saw only the street vendor, the friendly face behind the cart. But today, they might see a different side of Roy Patel. The clock on the nearby church tower struck 2, its chimes faintly audible over the noise of the street. Business was slowing down as the lunch rush tapered off, but Roy remained busy, cleaning his cart and restocking ingredients for the afternoon crowd. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, each task a small ritual he had performed countless times. But beneath the calm exterior, Roy was attuned to every sound and movement around him. His eyes, though focused on his work, subtly scanned the area, observing without drawing attention. It was a habit ingrained in him after years of serving in environments where letting one's guard down, even for a second, could mean the difference between life and death. The group of bikers remained parked at the corner, their laughter occasionally erupting in bursts that carried across the street. They weren't doing anything overtly disruptive yet, but their presence was hard to ignore. Roy could feel their eyes on him, could sense the way they gestured in his direction, laughing as if sharing a private joke. He didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Instead, he focused on his work, keeping his emotions firmly in check. A young couple approached the cart, holding hands and chatting softly. "2 lamb kebabs, please," the man said, his tone polite. "Of course," Roy replied, his voice steady as he reached for the skewers. As he worked, the man glanced toward the bikers and frowned. "They've been here all day," he muttered to his partner. "Don't they have somewhere else to go?" The woman shrugged, her eyes darting nervously in the biker's direction. "Let's just grab our food and leave," she whispered. Roy handed them their kebabs with a polite nod, pretending not to hear their exchange. But the man's words lingered in his mind. The biker's laughter grew louder, drawing the attention of more passers-by. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a cigarette dangling from his lips, stood up from his bike and stretched lazily. He turned toward Roy's cart, his smirk widening as he started walking over. Roy's grip on the tongs tightened ever so slightly. "Hey, old man," the biker called out, his voice loud and grating. "You got any food left for me and my boys?" Roy looked up, his expression calm. "Of course," he said simply. "What would you like?" The biker leaned on the edge of the cart, his leather jacket creaking as he rested his weight on one elbow. His eyes roamed over the display of ingredients before settling on Roy's face. "What's good here?" he asked, the question dripping with mockery. "Everything," Roy replied, his tone even. "I wouldn't serve it if it wasn't." The biker chuckled, looking over his shoulder at his friends, who were watching the exchange with interest. "Well, aren't you confident?" he said, turning back to Roy. "All right, give me your best kebab. And make it fast. I don't like waiting." Roy nodded, reaching for a skewer. His movements were as precise as ever, but his mind was racing, calculating. As he placed the kebab on the grill, the biker began fiddling with a bottle of ketchup on the counter, twisting the cap off and on. He wasn't hungry, that much was clear. This was about something else. The smell of grilling meat wafted into the air as Roy turned the skewer, his focus unwavering. "Here you go," he said, handing the kebab to the biker. The man took it, but instead of eating, he held it up as if inspecting it. "This better be good," he muttered, taking a small bite. Then he made a show of grimacing. "Ugh, what is this? Did you forget to season it?" Roy remained silent, his expression unreadable. The biker tossed the half-eaten kebab onto the ground, laughing. "Looks like I'll have to go somewhere else for lunch." His friends erupted in laughter, their voices carrying across the street. Roy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he bent down, picked up the discarded skewer, and placed it in the trash. Nearby, a group of pedestrians watched the scene unfold, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disapproval. But no one stepped in, and the bikers seemed to thrive on the attention, their antics growing bolder. "Hey, old man," another biker called out, striding toward the cart. This one was shorter but stockier, with tattoos snaking up his arms. "How much for one of these fancy kebabs?" $5, Roy replied evenly. $5? For this junk?" The biker laughed, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill and slapping it onto the counter. "Here's one. That should be enough, right?" Roy looked at the bill, then at the biker. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm. "But I can't serve you for less than the price." The biker's grin faded, replaced by a scowl. "You trying to cheat me, old man?" "No," Roy replied. "I'm just running a business." The tension in the air was palpable. A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Roy's thoughts drifted, just for a moment, to a time long ago. A time when he had faced men far more dangerous than these. He remembered the weight of his rifle, the smell of sweat and dirt, the adrenaline that came with every mission. He had dealt with threats far greater than a group of overconfident bikers. But this wasn't the battlefield, and he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a man running a food cart, trying to make an honest living. Or so everyone thought. The stocky biker grabbed the ketchup bottle from the counter and squeezed it, sending a stream of red sauce onto the pavement. His friends roared with laughter, egging him on. Roy remained silent, his hands steady as he wiped the counter clean. He didn't rise to their provocations, didn't let the frustration show on his face. But inside, a storm was brewing. He had promised himself, years ago, that he would leave his old life behind. That he would live quietly, without violence or confrontation. But there were moments like this one when that promise was hard to keep. The bikers were pushing their luck, testing his patience. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the mid-afternoon calm, cutting through the hum of city life like an unwelcome alarm. Heads turned as the group of bikers rolled up to the corner, their chrome machines gleaming under the sunlight. Dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches and studs, they exuded an air of unchecked arrogance, their movements loud and commanding as they parked their bikes near Roy's cart. "Hey, old man," one of them shouted, his voice carrying over the chatter of pedestrians. The leader of the group, a stocky, bearded man with a sneer permanently etched on his face, strolled up to the cart. He slapped a crumpled dollar bill onto the counter with a mocking grin. "One kebab. Extra fast, all right." Roy looked up from the grill, his calm eyes meeting the man's. $5, he replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. The biker tilted his head, his grin widening as though Roy had just told a joke. $5? For this?" He gestured dismissively at the cart. "You gotta be kidding me." Roy didn't respond. He simply turned back to the grill, his movements unhurried as he flipped the skewers, letting the sizzling sound of meat fill the silence. The other bikers began to close in, forming a loose circle around the cart. Their laughter was loud, their presence magnetic in the worst way, drawing attention from passers-by who slowed their steps but kept their distance. The tallest of the group, a lanky man with a scar running across his jaw, leaned over the counter, his leather jacket creaking as he knocked over a bottle of mustard with his elbow. It clattered to the ground, yellow liquid spilling onto the pavement. "What's with the slow service, huh?" he jeered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're too good to serve us?" Another biker, younger and wiry, chimed in, pointing at the handwritten sign on the cart. "What's this? Fresh and delicious? Man, I've had dog food that probably tastes better." The group erupted into laughter, their voices echoing across the street. Roy's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. His shoulders squared slightly, his stance widening just enough to signal readiness to anyone trained to notice. He reached for the mustard bottle on the ground, setting it back on the counter without a word. Nearby customers shuffled uncomfortably. A mother hurried her child away, casting a concerned glance over her shoulder. A group of office workers murmured among themselves, but none of them intervened. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they could see the imbalance: the five rowdy bikers, brimming with bravado, against the lone food vendor who appeared small and unassuming in comparison. What could anyone do? The bearded biker, seemingly emboldened by Roy's lack of reaction, stepped closer. He snatched a skewer from the grill, ignoring the hiss of the heat, and took a bite. Chewing exaggeratedly, he grimaced and spat the half-eaten meat onto the ground. "What is this?" he scoffed, waving the skewer in Roy's face. "You call this food?" The bikers roared with laughter again, their amusement growing with each insult. Roy, still calm, reached for the trash bin and held it out toward the man. "If you're done with it, throw it away," he said quietly. The biker blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Roy's composure. But the surprise quickly morphed into irritation. He shoved the skewer into the trash with unnecessary force, his lips curling into a sneer. "You got guts, old man," he muttered. The scarred biker stepped forward next, grabbing a handful of napkins from the counter and tossing them into the air like confetti. "You gonna clean that up too?" he taunted, his tone dripping with mockery. Roy didn't answer. He simply picked up the napkins, one by one, his movements deliberate and calm. The wiry biker leaned against the cart, tapping his knuckles on the metal surface. "What's your deal, man? You deaf or just dumb?" Roy straightened, dusting his hands off before looking at the group. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "Are you here for food?" he asked, his voice measured, "or just to make trouble?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the biker's laughter like a blade. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the leader stepped forward, his smirk widening as he tilted his head. Maybe both, he said, leaning in closer. What's it to you? The tension was palpable now, thick enough to make the bystanders hold their breath. Roy remained still, his hands resting on the counter, his eyes never leaving the leaders. To anyone else, Roy looked unbothered, like a man who had seen this kind of behavior before and wasn't impressed. But inside, his instincts were firing on all cylinders. He wasn't afraid. Fear was an emotion he had learned to control long ago. What he felt now was something closer to focus, a razor-sharp awareness of every detail, every movement, every potential threat. Years of military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to think strategically even in the face of aggression. He wasn't about to let a group of bullies dictate his actions. But he also knew that confrontation, if it came, would have to be swift and decisive. "Hey, boss," one of the bikers called out, pointing to the cash box sitting on the counter. "Think he's got much in there?" The leader's eyes flicked to the box, his grin widening. "Yeah, I bet he's rolling in dough, selling these overpriced kebabs to suckers all day." Roy's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter, the first visible sign of tension. "Don't," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The leader raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Don't what?" "Don't touch the cash box," Roy replied, his tone steady. The leader chuckled, his hand hovering over the box. "What are you gonna do about it, old man?" It was a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. The bikers waited, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They expected Roy to back down, to stammer out a plea or maybe even step aside. That's what people usually did when faced with their antics. But Roy didn't back down. He stood his ground, his gaze locked on the leader. "I'm asking nicely," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Leave the box alone." The leader's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. There was something in Roy's tone, something controlled and deliberate, that made him hesitate. But pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for the box. Roy moved. It happened so fast that most of the bystanders didn't realize what they were seeing until it was over. One moment, the leader's hand was hovering over the cash box. The next, it was pinned to the counter, Roy's hand gripping his wrist with surprising force. The leader yelped, his bravado crumbling as he tried to pull free. But Roy didn't let go. His grip was firm, unyielding, and his eyes calm and steady seemed to pierce through the man's bluster. "Enough," Roy said, his voice low but commanding. The other bikers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. For the first time, the atmosphere shifted. The man they had been mocking, the old man they thought they could intimidate, wasn't what he seemed. Roy released the leader's wrist, and the man stumbled back, cradling his hand as though it had been burned. He stared at Roy, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. "You're gonna regret that," he snarled, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments ago. Roy didn't respond. He simply returned to his grill, his movements calm and deliberate, as though nothing had happened. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado now tempered by caution. They had expected an easy target, a meek vendor who wouldn't dare stand up to them. What they found instead was someone who didn't flinch under pressure, someone who exuded a quiet authority that demanded respect. And though they didn't know it yet, they had just crossed a line. Roy's calm exterior hid a past they couldn't begin to imagine. And if they pushed him further, they were about to find out just how big of a mistake they had made. The leader of the bikers, still nursing his bruised ego and smarting wrist, stepped back from the cart. His face flushed red with a mix of embarrassment and simmering anger. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with unspoken challenge. His friends, sensing his humiliation, rallied around him like vultures, their laughter uneasy but edged with malice. "Old man thinks he's tough," muttered the lanky, scarred biker. He stepped closer to Roy, his hands twitching as though eager to escalate things further. Maybe we need to teach him a little lesson. Show him what happens when you mess with us. Roy didn't flinch. He kept his focus on the grill, turning the skewers with steady precision. The sizzling sound of the cooking kebab seemed to punctuate the tense silence that followed the biker's words. For a man surrounded by hostility, Roy looked almost unnervingly calm. But Roy wasn't the only one who noticed the shift in the group. The few remaining onlookers, those too curious or concerned to leave, began to sense that things might spiral out of control. A young man in a suit nervously adjusted his tie and took a hesitant step forward, as though considering whether to intervene. An older woman holding her groceries tightly to her chest whispered, "Somebody should call the police." Yet, no one acted. Fear paralyzed them. They saw the leather jackets, the tattoos, the aggressive posturing, and made the same calculation Roy had already anticipated. These were not men who responded well to authority or to reason. Still, they hadn't counted on Roy being anything but a vendor. That miscalculation would cost them. The bearded leader squared his shoulders, stepping forward again to regain control of the situation. "You think you're a tough guy, huh?" he sneered, jabbing a finger in Roy's direction. "You think you can just disrespect us like that?" Roy finally looked up, meeting the man's eyes. His gaze was steady and unreadable, like a still lake concealing unfathomable depths. He didn't need to raise his voice. His quiet tone cut through the tension like a scalpel. "I gave you a warning," Roy said, his words measured, deliberate. "I suggest you listen this time." The leader hesitated, his bravado wavering under Roy's unblinking stare. There was something unsettling about the man behind the cart, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But the leader pushed the feeling aside, doubling down on his false confidence. "And what if I don't?" he challenged, crossing his arms. His friends jeered behind him, their laughter forced but loud enough to bolster his ego. "What are you gonna do about it?" Roy straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a clean towel before setting it down on the counter. He stepped out from behind the cart, his movements deliberate, controlled. For the first time, the onlookers got a proper look at him: his broad shoulders, his disciplined posture, the way his faded polo shirt clung to the wiry strength underneath. But it wasn't just his physique that caught their attention. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his every step, the kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. Roy didn't puff out his chest or throw out threats. He simply stood there, calm and unyielding, like an immovable mountain. The leader smirked, trying to mask his unease. "Oh, look at this guy," he mocked, gesturing for his friends to laugh. "What are you, some kind of ex-cop? Retired security guard?" Roy didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the group with unsettling precision. He wasn't looking at their faces anymore. He was assessing their movements, noting the positions of their hands, the way they shifted their weight, the subtle signs of their intent. It was instinct, deeply ingrained and automatic, honed over decades of training. One of the bikers, a younger man with a buzz cut and a mean streak, stepped forward, eager to prove himself. "You think you're better than us, old man," he spat, puffing out his chest. "You're nothing but a street vendor. You don't scare us." Roy's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. It was something colder, a flicker of restrained amusement that only deepened the growing unease in the group. "You're mistaken," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made the young biker hesitate mid-step. "I'm not trying to scare you." The buzz-cut biker faltered, glancing back at his leader for reassurance. The leader scowled, shoving him forward. "Don't back down. He's just bluffing." But the buzz-cut biker wasn't so sure. There was no bluff in Roy's stance, no hesitation in his tone. There was only certainty, the kind that came from experience these bikers couldn't begin to comprehend. The leader, growing impatient, decided to escalate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with a practiced motion. The blade gleamed menacingly in the sunlight, drawing gasps from the small crowd that had gathered at a distance. "Oh, now you're quiet," the leader said, smirking as he twirled the blade between his fingers. "Not so tough anymore, huh?" Roy's eyes flicked to the knife, then back to the leader. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked bored. "I've seen better," Roy said flatly. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "You've got a death wish, old man." Roy tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "No," he replied calmly. "But if you take one more step, you might." The crowd murmured in shock at Roy's words. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering under the weight of his confidence. The leader, however, couldn't back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He lunged. It happened faster than anyone could process. One moment, the leader was charging at Roy with the blade in hand. The next, he was on the ground, the knife skittering across the pavement as Roy stood over him, completely unscathed. The move was so smooth, so precise, that it left the onlookers and the bikers in stunned silence. Roy had disarmed and subdued the man in the blink of an eye, using nothing but a simple, fluid motion. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, a testament to years of discipline and training. The leader groaned, clutching his wrist as he tried to sit up. Roy didn't give him the chance. He planted a foot firmly on the man's chest, keeping him pinned to the ground. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was no mistaking the steel in his tone. "I told you," Roy said, his eyes locking onto the remaining bikers. "Don't push me." The remaining bikers froze, their confidence shattered. They had underestimated him, seen only the street vendor and not the man behind the apron. Now, they weren't so sure what they were dealing with. Roy released the leader, stepping back and letting him scramble to his feet. The man staggered, his face pale with humiliation and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You have two choices," Roy said, addressing the group. "You can leave now and forget this ever happened. Or you can stay and find out how much worse it can get." The bikers hesitated, their bravado completely drained. They glanced at each other, silently weighing their options. Finally, the leader spat on the ground, his face twisted with defeat. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, motioning for his friends to follow. They hurried to their bikes, their movements clumsy and rushed. Within moments, the roar of their engines filled the air once more as they sped away, disappearing down the street. The tension in the air lingered for a moment longer before dissolving, replaced by a stunned silence. The onlookers slowly began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Roy returned to his cart, picking up the fallen mustard bottle and adjusting the skewers on the grill as though nothing had happened. To him, it was just another day. But to everyone else, it was clear, Roy was no ordinary street vendor. The harassment showed no signs of stopping. The bikers were emboldened by Roy's apparent indifference, their antics growing bolder with each passing minute. One of them, a wiry man with a shaved head and a mean grin, started flicking ketchup packets at Roy, cackling with glee as they landed around his feet. Another biker kicked over the trash can beside the cart, scattering its contents across the pavement. "Clean it up, old man," the leader barked, his grin wide as the rest of the group howled in laughter. Roy bent down, his movements unhurried, and began gathering the spilled garbage. His calm demeanor only seemed to agitate the bikers further. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to snap. "Come on, man," the lanky biker with the skull and crossbones tattoo drawled. "Show us you've got a spine." He reached over the counter and grabbed a skewer of kebabs, deliberately taking a large bite. Not bad," he said through a mouthful of food. Roy straightened, his sharp eyes briefly locking onto the biker's tattoo. The faintest flicker of recognition crossed his face, gone so quickly it was almost imperceptible. He didn't reach for the skewer or make any attempt to stop the man. Instead, he spoke again, his tone steady but with a hint of steel beneath it. "Gentlemen," Roy said, carefully wiping his hands on a towel, "this is your last chance to walk away." The leader snorted, crossing his arms. "Or what? You gonna hit us with a spatula?" His friends erupted in laughter, slapping each other on the back. But something about Roy's calmness made the youngest biker, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, shuffle uneasily. He tugged at his leader's sleeve. "Maybe we should go, man," he murmured, his voice low. "This guy's different." The leader rounded on him, his expression hardening. "Different? He's a washed-up old man slinging meat on a stick. Don't tell me you're scared of him." The kid hesitated, glancing at Roy, who was now silently arranging his skewers. There was no fear in Roy's eyes, no anger. Just an unsettling calm that seemed to say he had already calculated every possible outcome and none of them ended well for the bikers. One of the onlookers, a young woman with her phone in hand, stepped closer to the scene, recording the interaction. "You guys should leave him alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The leader turned on her, pointing a finger. "Mind your own business, lady, unless you wanna be next." Roy's hand twitched, just barely, as if he were holding himself back. His gaze briefly flicked to the woman, then back to the group. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as though centering himself. The youngest biker, still visibly uncomfortable, took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between Roy and the rest of the group. "I'm serious, man," he said again, louder this time. "Something's off about this guy." The leader rolled his eyes and turned back to Roy, clearly done with the standoff. "All right, enough of this. You wanna play tough? Let's see what you've got." He reached for Roy's collar, but the move never landed. In a single fluid motion, Roy sidestepped, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it just enough to make him yelp in pain. The bikers froze, their laughter dying instantly. Roy released the man just as quickly, stepping back and raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's not make this worse," Roy said, his tone still calm but now carrying a distinct edge. The leader stumbled back, clutching his wrist and glaring at Roy with a mix of shock and rage. "You think you're funny, old man," he snarled. Roy didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the towel on the counter and began cleaning the surface with meticulous precision, as though nothing had happened. The bikers, now visibly unsettled, began muttering among themselves. "Did you see that?" one whispered. "He's fast. Too fast." The youngest biker took another step back, his face pale. "I told you," he said, his voice shaky. "He's not normal. Look at how calm he is." But the leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. He pulled a chain from his pocket, letting it clink ominously as he swung it in slow circles. "This ain't over," he growled, stepping forward again. Roy's hand stilled, resting on the counter. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he straightened, turning to face the leader fully. "You're making a mistake," Roy said quietly. The leader sneered. "Yeah? And what are you gonna do about it?" Roy's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made the leader hesitate for just a fraction of a second. "Let me give you some advice," Roy said, his voice low and deliberate. "You should never pick a fight with someone when you don't know what they're capable of." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now fully replaced by uncertainty. Meanwhile, the young boy watching with his mother whispered again, "Mom, I think he's like a superhero." Roy overheard, glancing briefly at the boy. This time, his lips curved into a faint smile, a smile that disappeared as quickly as it came. The tension between Roy and the bikers reached its peak, the air around them charged with the promise of something about to snap. But Roy remained still, waiting, watching, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He didn't need to attack. He didn't need to raise his voice. Everything about him, his posture, his expression, the calm confidence in his eyes spoke louder than words ever could. And slowly, it began to dawn on the bikers. They weren't in control of this situation. They never had been. The youngest biker made the first move, backing away completely. "I'm out," he said, throwing up his hands. "I'm not messing with this guy." The leader whipped around, furious. "Coward," he spat. But even the others were starting to falter, their earlier bravado nowhere to be found. One by one, they began to step back, muttering excuses. The leader stood alone now, his chain hanging limply in his hand. He looked at Roy, then at his retreating crew, and finally, with a frustrated growl, he threw the chain to the ground. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled before stalking back to his bike. Roy didn't respond. He simply watched as the bikers revved their engines and roared off into the distance, their departure leaving behind a tense silence. As the onlookers began to disperse, murmuring about what they had just witnessed, Roy returned to his cart. He adjusted the skewers on the grill, tidied the counter, and wiped his hands on the towel, his movements as calm and methodical as ever. To the crowd, it was over. But to Roy, it was far from finished. Because deep down, he knew the bikers would be back. And next time, they wouldn't just bring their egos. They'd bring something far more dangerous. But Roy wasn't worried. After all, they had no idea who they were dealing with. As the dust settled and the bikers roared off, Roy stood silently by his cart, his face unreadable. The nearby onlookers gradually dispersed, whispering among themselves about the confrontation. Some glanced back at Roy with a mix of admiration and confusion. He hadn't done much, or at least, not outwardly, but the way he handled himself left an impression. The young boy, still clutching his mother's hand, turned back for one last look. "Mom," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Do you think he's a ninja?" The mother gave a nervous laugh, tugging her son along. "Come on, sweetie. Let's go." As Calm returned to the street corner, Roy resumed his work. He adjusted the grill temperature, arranged the skewers, and wiped the counter, all with the same deliberate, precise movements. To any casual observer, it might have seemed like nothing had happened. But Roy's mind was far from calm. He glanced toward the street, where the bikers had disappeared. A storm was brewing, he could feel it in the air. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The leader's parting words echoed in his mind, "This isn't over, old man." Roy had dealt with men like them before, bullies who mistook kindness for weakness, who believed that strength came from loud voices and reckless bravado. He had faced worse in his lifetime, far worse than a group of arrogant bikers. Still, the encounter had stirred something within him, something he had buried long ago. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Roy began packing up his cart. The day's events replayed in his mind as he stacked the skewers and wiped down the grill. His hands moved on autopilot, the actions so familiar they required no thought. It wasn't until he reached for his lockbox, a sturdy metal case where he kept his earnings, that he noticed the faint tremor in his hands. He stilled them quickly, clenching his fists and taking a deep breath. Not now, he thought. Not yet. Locking the cart, he slung his bag over his shoulder and began the walk home. Roy's home was modest, a small apartment tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The walls were bare except for a single photograph on the mantel, a younger Roy, dressed in military fatigues, standing beside a group of fellow soldiers. The edges of the photo were worn, the colors faded with time. He stared at the photo for a long moment before turning away. The scars on his hands, the disciplined precision in his movements, the calm under pressure, it all traced back to a life he had left behind. A life that now felt like a distant memory, but one that could never truly be forgotten. The next day, Roy arrived at the corner of Maple and Fifth as usual, his cart gleaming and ready for business. The morning passed uneventfully, with a steady stream of customers stopping by for their usual orders. But as the afternoon wore on, Roy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Across the street, in the shadow of a bus stop, two of the bikers stood leaning against a lamp post. They weren't causing a scene this time, but their presence was enough to draw attention. One of them, the wiry man with the shaved head, was staring directly at Roy, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. Roy ignored them, focusing on his customers. But he couldn't ignore the tension building in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't long before the bikers made their move. They strolled across the street, their swagger unmistakable, and stopped in front of Roy's cart. This time, they didn't bother with pretense. "You thought you were clever yesterday, huh?" the wiry man sneered. Roy didn't answer. He continued preparing a customer's order, his movements calm and deliberate. The biker reached out and knocked over a cup of sauce, letting it spill across the counter. "We're talking to you, old man." Roy set the kebab down carefully and looked up, meeting the man's gaze. His eyes were steady, unblinking. "If you want food, place an order. If not, move along." The second biker snorted. "You don't give the orders here, Grandpa." Roy sighed, his patience wearing thin. "I'm asking you nicely. Don't make me ask again." The wiry man stepped closer, his face inches from Roy's. "Or what?" he hissed. And then, without warning, Roy moved. His hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist in an iron hold. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it was enough to make the man freeze. Roy's grip was firm, controlled just enough to send a message. "Let go," the biker growled, trying to pull away. Roy didn't budge. His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it now. "Walk away." The second biker reached for something in his jacket, a switchblade. The flash of steel caught Roy's eye, but he didn't panic. In one fluid motion, Roy twisted the wiry man's arm, forcing him to drop to his knees with a yelp of pain. His other hand shot out, disarming the second biker before he even realized what was happening. The blade clattered to the ground. By now, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs growing louder. Some were recording the scene on their phones, while others simply watched in stunned silence. Roy released the wiry man, who stumbled back, clutching his wrist. His companion grabbed him by the arm, pulling him away. "This isn't over," the wiry man spat, his face red with humiliation. "You're gonna regret this." Roy didn't respond. He simply picked up the switchblade, folded it neatly, and set it on the counter. As the bikers retreated, the crowd erupted into applause. Some customers approached Roy, patting him on the back and praising his bravery. But Roy didn't smile. He knew this wasn't the end. That night, as Roy sat in his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The bikers wouldn't let this go. Their pride was wounded, and they would come back stronger, angrier, and more prepared. Roy reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered box. Inside was a collection of items from his past, a pair of dog tags, a folded map, and a medal engraved with the words "For Valor." He ran his fingers over the metal, his mind drifting back to a time when his skills were used for far greater battles. Roy's calm demeanor remained as he adjusted the cart, picking up the toppled condiments and brushing off the dust. The small crowd that had gathered stood frozen in stunned silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "Is he serious?" whispered a man in the back. "Special Forces," murmured another. The young boy from the previous day stepped forward, his wide eyes locked on Roy. "Were you really in the army, Mr. Roy?" Roy crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze with a small, reassuring smile. "Yes, young man. A long time ago." The boy's mother quickly pulled him back, her expression a mixture of awe and caution. "Let's go, darling. Come on." She nodded briefly at Roy, a silent acknowledgement of his strength, before hurrying away. Despite the bikers' retreat, Roy knew the matter wasn't over. He'd seen their type before, men driven by pride and fear of losing face. They wouldn't let humiliation be the final word. For now, though, the corner of Maple and Fifth returned to its usual rhythm. Customers resumed placing their orders, though many cast lingering glances at Roy, their curiosity barely contained. As dusk fell, Roy packed up his cart with the same practiced precision. But this time, there was an added layer of readiness in his movements. His mind replayed the encounter, his instincts sharpening with every detail. Later that evening, back in his modest apartment, Roy sat at his small kitchen table. The box of memories was open in front of him again, its contents scattered. Dog tags, faded photographs, a service knife, and a crumpled certificate of commendation. His fingers hovered over a particular item, a weathered patch with the insignia of the Indian Army's elite para special forces, a reminder of a life he had long left behind. "Old habits die hard," he murmured to himself, the corner of his mouth curling into a faint smile. Roy rose and walked to the closet, retrieving a small duffel bag. Inside were a few items he had kept just in case. He pulled out a compact tactical flashlight, sturdy gloves, and a sheathed combat knife. His movements were methodical, each action carrying a sense of purpose. The following day, Roy arrived at his usual spot earlier than usual, his cart gleaming under the morning sun. Business went on as normal, but his eyes scanned the street constantly. Every shadow, every distant sound, was analyzed with practiced precision. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the bikers returned. They came in force this time, 6 motorcycles roaring down the street, their riders clad in leather and glaring with unmistakable intent. The leader, nursing a bandaged wrist, dismounted first, his face twisted in anger. "Hey, old man," he barked, his voice echoing across the street. "You think you can embarrass us and get away with it?" Roy didn't respond immediately. He finished handing a kebab to a customer and calmly wiped his hands on a towel before turning to face the group. "You came back," Roy said evenly, his tone devoid of fear. "You're damn right we did," another biker snarled, stepping forward. "We don't let people mess with us." The leader gestured to the others, and they began spreading out, surrounding the cart. Onlookers backed away, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. One biker picked up a chair from a nearby cafe and hurled it to the ground, the crash sending a shockwave through the tense air. "Enough," Roy said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The bikers paused, caught off guard by the sheer authority in his tone. Roy stepped out from behind the cart, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood tall, his posture impossibly straight, and fixed each biker with a gaze so intense it felt as though he could see straight into their souls. "I gave you a chance to walk away," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "You chose to come back. That was your mistake." The leader laughed, though it sounded forced. Big words for a guy with a food cart. Roy's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "You think I'm just a vendor? You're not the first to underestimate me." Before the leader could reply, Roy moved. It happened so fast that the bikers didn't have time to react. One moment, Roy was standing still, the next, he had disarmed the closest biker, twisting his arm in a move so fluid it looked almost effortless. The biker yelped in pain as he dropped the crowbar he had been holding. Roy released him with a controlled push, sending him stumbling backward. Another biker lunged, swinging a chain, but Roy sidestepped with ease, his movements precise and efficient. He grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanked it free, and tossed it aside in one smooth motion. The crowd gasped, their phones capturing every second of the action. "Who is this guy?" one of the bikers muttered, his confidence visibly shaken. "Retired Sergeant Major Roy Patel," Roy said, his voice steady and clear. "Indian Army Special Forces. And if you had any sense, you'd leave now." His words hung in the air, heavy with authority and unshakable certainty. The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering as he stared at the man before him. Roy wasn't just a street vendor. He was something far more formidable, and the bikers were beginning to realize it. "Let's get out of here," one of the younger bikers muttered, backing toward his bike. The leader glared at him, but the others were already retreating, their earlier bravado replaced with fear. "Smart choice," Roy said, watching as they mounted their bikes. The leader lingered for a moment, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he spat on the ground and climbed onto his motorcycle. "This isn't over," he growled, but his words lacked conviction. Roy didn't respond. He simply watched as the group roared away, their engines fading into the distance. As the street returned to calm, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the surrounding buildings. Roy, however, remained composed. He returned to his cart, adjusted a few items, and resumed serving his customers as if nothing had happened. But the onlookers knew better. Roy Patel wasn't just a vendor. He was a man with a past that had resurfaced when it was needed most. And though he didn't seek trouble, it was clear that he was more than capable of handling it when it came his way. For those who had witnessed the day's events, one thing was certain: Maple and Fifth would never be the same again. As the bikers disappeared into the distance, the street corner at Maple and Fifth transformed. The tension that had gripped the area dissipated, replaced by a mixture of relief, admiration, and curiosity. The small crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers, clapping, and whistling as if they'd just witnessed a movie hero saving the day. But Roy didn't bask in the applause. He simply returned to his cart, adjusting a few items knocked over during the commotion, his movements calm and deliberate. His focus wasn't on the noise around him, it was on restoring order to his small world. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward, his expression a mix of gratitude and awe. "Thank you for standing up to them, Mr. Roy," he said, his voice earnest. "We should have done something earlier. They've been terrorizing this area for weeks." Roy looked up, offering a polite smile. "There's no need to thank me," he replied, his tone humble yet firm. "Violence should always be a last resort. But sometimes, bullies need to be reminded there are consequences." The man nodded, his admiration clear. "Well, you've reminded all of us today. You didn't just stand up to them, you showed us what real courage looks like." As word of the incident spread, Roy's cart became an unlikely symbol of resilience. People who had never stopped by before now lined up, not just to buy his delicious kebabs but to thank him for his bravery. "You gave us our neighborhood back," said an elderly woman, clutching a bag of groceries as she waited in line. "You've inspired my son," another customer said, motioning toward a young boy who waved shyly at Roy. For the first time in years, Roy found himself at the center of attention, a role he neither sought nor particularly enjoyed. But he handled it with grace, responding to each person with the same warmth and humility he had always shown. The bikers, meanwhile, had not escaped unscathed. Their public humiliation had not gone unnoticed. Within hours of the confrontation, videos of the incident began circulating online. Clips showing Roy's incredible composure and the effortless way he had subdued the bikers went viral. "Retired Army Sergeant takes down gang of bikers" became the headline of the day. The comments flooded in, ranging from admiration to outright awe. "This guy's a legend. Never mess with someone who's trained to fight wars. That wrist grab was straight out of a martial arts movie." The leader of the biker gang, still nursing his injured wrist, found himself the subject of ridicule. The humiliation was more than he could bear. By the end of the week, the gang disbanded, its members too embarrassed to show their faces around town again. Despite the newfound fame, Roy's life remained largely unchanged. He continued to wake up early, set up his cart, and serve his regular customers. But the neighborhood had changed. The once quiet corner of Maple and Fifth was now bustling with activity. Families felt safe bringing their children to the area again. Local vendors, emboldened by Roy's stand, began reclaiming their space. Even the police, who had once been slow to respond to complaints about the bikers, made more frequent patrols through the neighborhood. It seemed as though Roy's actions had sparked a ripple effect, restoring not just safety but a sense of community. One day, as Roy packed up his cart for the evening, he was approached by the young boy who had watched the entire incident unfold. "Mr. Roy," the boy asked hesitantly, clutching a small notebook. Roy crouched down to his level, smiling gently. "What is it, lad? Can you teach me?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. "I want to be brave like you." Roy chuckled softly, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Bravery isn't about fighting," he said. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. You don't need to learn to fight to be brave, you just need a strong heart." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'll remember that," he said earnestly. As the days turned into weeks, life returned to its familiar rhythms. But for those who had witnessed Roy's actions, things would never quite be the same. The street vendor with the quiet demeanor and humble cart was no longer just Mr. Roy. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that heroes often come in the most unassuming forms. And though Roy never sought recognition or fame, he couldn't deny the satisfaction that came from knowing he had made a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the street lights flickered to life, Roy stood by his cart, watching the world around him. The neighborhood was alive with laughter and conversation, a stark contrast to the fear and tension that had once plagued it. A small smile played on Roy's lips as he folded his apron and placed it neatly in his bag. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, the quietest battles leave the loudest echoes. And with that, he wheeled his cart away, disappearing into the glow of the streetlights, a quiet man with an extraordinary legacy. As the final rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky transformed into a canvas of vibrant oranges and soft purples. Roy's small cart stood quietly in the dimming light, its work for the day done. He began the ritual of packing up, the familiar motion soothing, almost meditative. The once busy street now felt peaceful, the evening air cool and calming. Just as he finished closing the cart, a familiar sound reached his ears. He turned, and there was the young boy from earlier, running toward him. The boy's face was wide-eyed, his energy and curiosity unmistakable as he approached. "Sir, were you really a soldier?" the boy asked, his voice filled with awe. Roy paused, his hands still holding onto the edges of the cart. He bent down slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. There was a long moment of silence between them, the world seeming to slow as Roy thought about how to respond. "I was," Roy said with a gentle smile. "But you know what's more important than being strong?" The boy's head tilted, his eyes eager, waiting for the answer. Roy gave a small chuckle, his expression softening. "Knowing when to use it." He patted the boy's shoulder with a light touch, his fingers briefly resting there, offering both comfort and wisdom. The boy, still processing the words, nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. He didn't fully understand it yet, but there was something in Roy's tone that made him feel as though he had just been given something precious, an idea that would stick with him for years to come. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice quiet but sincere. Roy straightened up, brushing the dust off his hands. "No need to thank me, lad. Just remember what I said." With that, Roy turned and started to walk away, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The fading light from the street lamps cast his silhouette in a golden glow, his figure becoming a part of the evening, slowly disappearing into the shadows of the street. And as Roy walked, something in the air seemed to shift. A quiet truth lingered behind him, hanging in the streets like an unspoken lesson. The people who had witnessed everything that day, whether they saw him as a simple street vendor or a quiet hero, were left with the same realization. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Heroes don't always announce themselves with a loud proclamation or grand gestures. Sometimes, heroes appear in the most unexpected places, with unassuming faces, offering strength not with their fists, but with their presence and their actions. Roy, with his steady hands and calm demeanor, had shown everyone what true strength looks like. It wasn't about how loudly you could fight, but how wisely you chose your battles. And so, Roy's quiet legacy continued, not just in the neighborhood where his cart sat each day, but in the hearts of everyone who had seen him stand up for what was right. In the way he had silently reminded the world that sometimes, the greatest power lies in restraint, in knowing when to act and when to let go. As Roy's figure grew smaller in the distance, a quiet satisfaction filled the streets. People who had once walked by without noticing, now looked at each other a little differently. It was as though they too had learned something that day, not just about fighting, but about understanding the strength that comes from within. It was a lesson that echoed long after Roy had disappeared into the evening. Heroes, as they say, are not always the ones who wear capes or make the headlines. Sometimes, they're the ones who serve kebabs on a quiet street corner, with a calm smile and a steady hand, showing everyone what it means to have true courage. And so, with each passing day, Roy continued to serve his kebabs, his role unchanged, but the world around him was different. Because, sometimes, all it takes is one quiet person to change everything. To remind us that the world can be better, kinder, and braver than we ever thought possible. And maybe, just maybe, that's what true strength is all about. As the last of the twilight faded and the street lights flickered on, Roy's silhouette blended with the shadows, a quiet figure who had left an indelible mark on a small corner of the world. The lesson he had taught, the bravery he had shown, would live on, passed down in stories and in the quiet actions of those who had witnessed his calm yet unshakable courage. A reminder, always, that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes, the quietest battles leave the loudest echoes. And Roy? He was just another man doing his work. But now, to everyone who passed by that corner, he was something more, a symbol of courage and strength, of restraint and wisdom. A symbol of the simple, quiet heroism that can change the world, one small act at a time.